Hey everyone, it's Marcy here with PNS and Nina. I am so excited today for this in the know because I have Mr. Louis Lombardi. Louis, how are you?
I'm doing good, thank you.
So now tell everyone. So I should go back and say that Louis does some legal research for me, which is how we met. When I have a question that I'm not entirely sure of, or you guys ask a question, I go to the man over here to see if we can't find some case law or what we need about it. But in another life, Louis, you were a police officer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a for 20 years I was a police officer in New York City. I worked in every borough but the Bronx, which I guess I'm a little lucky on that. But I did miss the Bronx Italian market, which would have been nice to partake in. And then while I was in the police department, I went to law school. Um, and when I retired as a police captain, and you know, I've been practicing law ever since. In 20 years I'm working in New York City, especially Manhattan, you'll see some interesting things.
Oh, I can only imagine, which
Yeah.
is why we're here today. So, some of you may have looked at our blog post that we did regarding deed fraud and some cases that we've seen across New York and how those came about and what happened. And as we were doing that, Louis said to me, "Hey, Marcy, I was actually involved in one of these deed theft cases." So, and now he just told me that there's even a movie about it somewhere, which we're going to have to Google and try to find it and put it in the comments for you later because I'm so excited that this was a big deal apparently in New York City. I honestly don't recall this, but that may have been, I'm in the Finger Lakes, maybe outside of New York City, and it wasn't on my radar at the time. But Louis, can you recap a little bit? Tell us about this case. Tell us how you got involved with it and what happened because it's really fascinating.
Well, it was a woman lived on the Upper East Side. Her name was Irene Silverman, very wealthy. I worked in the precinct that she lived in. Um, and during the summer of 1998, she went missing. Um, and it was, big thing in the papers because she was, page six is in the New York Post that, they talk about celebrities and stuff. So she was in that type of environment of people, and she would move around with, and she just went missing out of thin air. And eventually it turned out she was murdered by two grifters, Sante and Kenneth Kimes. Um, they she was, I think, their fourth murder that they committed in all their escapades. They murdered somebody in Hawaii, or suspected, Los Angeles, Vegas, and then the Bahamas. So they would, drift around the country and scheme and try to steal from people. How they got on the police radar is interesting, is that they weren't initially thought of as involved in her disappearance, but they were being tracked by the FBI for a check that bounced that they gave somebody in Utah when they bought a car to drive across the country. And that's how they came on everybody's radar. And eventually, they got caught. Um, the deed aspect to it is what they did, um, is they kept calling different notaries to see if they could get one that would notarize a document transferring the house that Irene lived in to them. I mean, the house, on the Upper East Side, even back in the 90s, was worth well into the millions. And so they were looking to steal that from her. She had no children. She was, alone. She had her friends, but she had no people to give her property to when she passed. So um, what they did is the mother of the gang of the group acted like Irene Silverman, being an old lady in bed, and they kept calling different notaries to come over to see if they would notarize a document. And finally, they got one. And then, unfortunately for that notary, she, she was disciplined by the state for her mistake.
So
Um,
now let me ask you this. So these individuals unfortunately murdered this lady to take possession of her home. Do we know, so they called a bunch of notaries and that notary went over there. Do we know anything about that particular notary in terms of, did she ask for ID? Did she not have ID? Did she not speak to the woman who was impersonating the owner of the house? Like, how did that piece happen?
They didn't. Well, they did find a lot of Social Security cards in their possession, which they were practicing Irene's
Signature?
signature. But no, they did not have any documentation. So that's why they kept calling different notaries. So the first two notaries that went would not notarize the document because they
Mm,
didn't have it. So obviously, if this third person walked out, they would have kept calling until they found
yeah.
somebody. And in any scam, generally, all you need to be is right on once, and that's what they did.
That is a true story. It's not
Yeah.
funny, but that is very true, right? Even
Mhm.
on my side of things, sometimes when people will call me to do something and I'm like, I can't do that. I'm sorry. It's against the law, or it's just not something that I can do for you. And they'll say, I can call someone else and get someone else to do it. And I'm always like, you probably can find someone else to do it.
Mhm.
Like, and I can't say anything to that other than, yes, probably someone out there eventually will agree to that. So that's not just in the notary world. I assume it's in all
Yeah.
worlds, but yeah, correct on that.
Yeah. I mean, their their scheming and their ability to pull these things off is incredible because how Irene got on their or radar is they were moving around. They moved around the country a lot, in and out of the country actually, and they were just down in Palm Beach, Florida, where they heard about this Irene's name and her wealth and what she, her charitable instincts that she was doing. And from that, they then researched her to figure out how to scam her and then to take her property from her.
So
Mm.
do you know how old, or approximately how old Irene was when this all occurred?
Oh, she was in her 80s, late 70s, 80s. She was actually she used to be a rockette. She used to do in New York City, the Christmas dance the Rockettes used to do.
Yeah.
She was a rockette in her day.
All right.
Um,
So, I mean, she seemed like she was going to say a perfect target. She was older. We see that a lot of older people. She didn't have any heirs, right? No one close to her. I mean, those kinds of things are what criminals in that case would look for.
Oh, absolutely. Because you don't want somebody looking around asking questions. And that's, why they killed her. They never found her body. She's like, they think somewhere out in the Meadowlands that she was dumped because one of the people who are involved said that they had driven out there. Um, so it's almost like a mafia movie. Disposing of the body, you never find the person. Um,
So, how did they get caught?
Well, they got caught, as I said earlier, they got on their radar and they got caught by the bad check in Utah that the FBI was. They got arrested in a hotel in Manhattan, one of the bigger famous hotels. Its name escapes me. They got arrested leaving there. And once they started looking into it, they saw some information that led them back to Irene.
So, they got back to Irene. They investigated. Do you remember what happened to that notary? Did she or he lose their commission, or were they just disciplined? Do we know?
I believe they lost their commission.
They lost
You
their
know,
commission.
yeah.
Do you know if they were prosecuted at all? And there was no one, I guess, actually, this shouldn't be the case. There was no one there to prosecute them, probably civilly, right? Because
Yeah,
Irene
I
had
mean the
no.
estate could have done it, but I mean, I guess it gets to what's the point? What's the point? Person's been harmed enough. The estate's not really going to recover anything because the
Sure.
property was never transferred at the end.
I was going
Um,
to ask. So, was that deed ever recorded? They just had it signed over, and I mean, although there's that thought of,
yeah,
still there's a
no, it did not get to the
transfer.
point of recording. What they did is the son, um, Kenneth, he acted as a person who needed to find somewhere to live, and she would take in renters here and there. Um, and the bait was for her to take him on because he had no real references. But from being down on Palm Beach, he did pick up a name of an old chef of hers and said that he knew the chef, and he paid in cash. because they didn't have any checks or any checks or anything. They gave him a check, it would have bounced within a day or two, and they would have been out. But he paid her in cash, which let her guard down a bit and let him in. And then once he got let in, they started to work on her. Now she was suspicious of them, and she was looking to eventually get rid of them, but they found what they needed to pull off their plan.
That's so such an
Yeah,
unfortunate story. But
yeah.
the interesting thing is that you're talking. This happened in the '90s. Is that correct?
Yeah, 1998. It was I had just finished law school. I was in between law school and getting ready to take the bar exam.
And so here we are in
Yeah.
2025, still talking about deed theft and home theft and all of these things. It seems like, these kinds of situations, unfortunately, we hear about, maybe not the extent of that publicity where there were these,
Yeah,
big name people and all of that, but we're still experiencing this in New York at kind of a rapid clip, it feels like.
it still goes on in New York City, especially with people who will go down to, like, say, Florida for 3, 4 months at a clip. Um, they'll come back and there'll be somebody in their house, and
Mm,
there's been a deed recorded. So it is a very big problem. Um, and notaries sometimes are in on it. Sometimes they're an unwitting rube. Like in this case. Um, so part of this is self-policing to get rid of these
sure.
things. The organization's looking out for it, and yourself. If somebody asks you to do something that is crazy, one, don't do it, and then two, is it reportable?
Mm.
Now, in this case, even if the notary who ended up notarizing the document reported it, it wouldn't have stopped the murder, because Irene was already killed at that time. But it would have solved it a lot quicker and everything.
Well, it's funny because in
Yeah.
1998, right, New York State didn't have identification requirements for the notary. We could take whatever we wanted that caused us to consider that to be a reasonable attempt at identifying that individual. So some of that hopefully has changed here in recent times where we now have certain types of ID or witnesses that we can use. It's very laid out in the law, along with, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, but journal requirements, right? That's another little bit of a deterrent. Maybe someone wouldn't want their information logged, or even for the notary. I say all the time, if you notarize, more than once or twice, it's unlikely you're going to remember all the details of every notarization you've ever done. But keeping a log and jotting down, little things that you've seen or heard might help jog your memory somewhere down the road. But certainly, yes,
Mm.
reporting, if you feel, I don't know, everyone feels like, well, I don't have, evidence, and it was just a feeling and I wasn't entirely sure. But I suspect that if you reported to the police department or the attorney general that you thought there might be some sort of fraud, I don't think they'd be upset about that, right? They'd want to know.
Yeah, they all have phone numbers, emails, whatever, to be contacted on suspicions. Um, and it goes back to 9/11. If you see something, say something. It's not
Yeah,
at the same level, but the legal system needs the ability, especially with property moving, that certainty that it's legitimate. Because look, in this case, say if they did transfer it and then they tried to sell it, a thief can never transfer title. So you would always go back, but think of all the people along the way that they could have stole from. So the estate,
100%.
the
Hmm.
estate would have gotten that house back. But if I sold it to a person, that person would be out of how many millions of dollars?
Well, and just the,
Mm.
the issues that that person would be going through to have that, that transaction reversed or nullified, or, the time or whatever was going on with them, that's
Oh,
just
and
tracking it
illegal
down.
expenses, yes.
Right. It's very
Mm.
expensive, right? And I think there was something recently where they're talking about someone's home got transferred and that person ended up getting evicted and they didn't know a place to live because they had to prove that their house had been transferred fraudulently. But in the interim, they still needed some place to go. And so it was this big idea of like, how would you be able to manage that? What if you didn't have that kind of income or those resources? So, I mean, it's very involved when we talk about deed and home,
Mm.
theft. But what so on your side of things, after hearing all of that and seeing all of that, like what are some good tips for notaries out there to like look for or be aware of when they're out there and someone asks them to do a deed transfer?
Well, in this case, I would say, an elderly woman in her bed acting, I think she at the time she was acting like she was a little sick or in bed. There's odd things. Why wouldn't they do it during like a business hours or come to you? Or if you do go to their house, meet and sit down with you. I think this goes also to wills and everything. One of the most important things I think a notary or the attorney doing a will ceremony or whatever the ceremony is, to talk to the person, get to know them. I mean, how long have they owned it? So, like in this case, how long have you owned this house? They don't know. So there's certain things. Just talking to somebody in general will either raise your awareness or put you more at ease. So just have a
Sure.
conversation with somebody 5, 10, 15 minutes before you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in an environment of convenience. It's
Mm.
convenient to have someone come to you at your house than it is to go see someone else. So that isn't indicative necessarily of something fraudulent, but what you say makes good sense. Sometimes, in cases of deed transfer or some things, if there's time, you wonder why that they would have an individual who maybe wasn't feeling well sign it at that time, unless there's some emergency. But having a conversation and asking some of those kinds of questions might be helpful if you are at all concerned, right? If there's any sort of false alarm. Certainly, there are lots of people who are not attempting deed fraud, and so they could be at home in bed and just want to get it done, or they're concerned about, their diagnosis or whatever that might be. But in this case, not being able necessarily to find an identification to provide that notary, right, that person is who it is, um, should require you to have a little bit more of um, what's the word I'm looking for? Now, I don't say concern because we have seen over and
Mm.
over and time again that older people a lot of times let their documentation lapse, right? They're not driving. I don't need a driver's license. I don't travel. I don't need a passport, which is why now having witnesses, for identification purposes is
Mhm.
great in New York State. It covers that, but certainly there should be. I remember once this woman was so kind. She didn't have any ID before requirements were, there were very specific requirements. She pulled out like every tax return that she had for like the past 20 years, right? That she had
Mm.
signed. She had like a diploma. She had school badges from like 30 years ago. I mean, this woman pulled out an arsenal of identification. So it was clear that, she kind of was who she was. And thinking that someone's older, they might have, documentation to back that up, but sometimes not, right? And so that has to be a question and that has to be posed in a way of, hey, I just want to protect you, right, in this transaction to make sure that this is really what you want to do. I'm gonna look for this. I'm so excited. I'm not excited. I'm so fascinated to see this movie that you're telling me that was made with Mary Tyler Moore. Is that what you told me? Mary Tyler Moore
Exactly.
played Irene.
Yeah.
Do you think so? Let me ask you this. This is like a personal thing here, just a hypothetical.
Mm.
Do you think that with the advent of AI and all of these other things, that it's going to be easier to commit deed fraud and home theft than maybe in the past?
Uh, it as anything in life, it depends. I think, with the advent of online notaries, yes, that could be an issue. But if you're a notary and you're doing it face to face, that should alleviate a lot of your concerns, especially if you talk to them. Like, when they do a will ceremony, before the attorney who's doing it or the notary, they talk to the person. They understand who their children are, if they're married, and this and everything. So you get almost like a little background on them and their life, so that they understand, you know, their assets and who will inherit from them. And if you take that into any signing that you do, something similar, you should be almost always protected.
Sure.
But I think AI, the big thing will be with, online notaries would be a big issue.
Well, the nice thing about
Yeah.
online is that it's recorded, right? So the hope is that
Mm.
that deters people a little bit too, because nobody wants to have their uh, fraudulent or criminal activities recorded for a
Mm.
good 10 years. But yes, I would agree with you that having conversations when you're uncomfortable is certainly important. I always like to say, though, notaries remember that we're not attorneys. We can't give any sort of legal advice, right? And sometimes if it's not warranted, like it's not necessary, right? I certainly wouldn't grill someone who had a very simple document that needed to be notarized and they had proper ID and there didn't seem to be any issues. But I might question it if they didn't have proper ID and there seemed like there was pressure or there were, all these extra individuals around who might be, pressuring that individual to sign or coercing them under some sort of duress. So certainly be careful. Louis, thank you
Yeah.
so much for talking to us about this case. It was fascinating. I really
Oh,
appreciate you.
anytime. I enjoyed it.
I'm
And
going to
if you,
let you know if
yeah.
I find this movie on TV. And for everyone out there, I'm going to put it in the comments if I do, because I want to watch it too.
Yeah. Take care.
Thanks, Louis. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
All right. Bye bye.